Nuclear testing in Australia, a secret most never hear about. In the middle of the vast red outback towns, vanished maps were redrawn, communities were silenced. This is the story of Emu Field, a place the world forgot where the British tested atomic weapons. Far from the eyes of most people, but not far from the homes of Aboriginal Australians, the 1950s brought a new kind of war. One fought with atoms, explosions bright as the sun, blasts shaking the desert earth, and radioactive clouds drifting silently on the wind. Emu Field was chosen for its remote location, a place considered empty and barren. But the land was alive, home to indigenous peoples with ancient ties, their lives and land disrupted forever. British nuclear tests began here in 1953, with Operation Totem. Two nuclear bombs exploded, shaking the earth and the lives around it. The government told few what was happening, and warned even fewer. The fallout spread, poisoning the land and water. Animals suffered mutations and people faced illnesses for decades after. Yet official records remained sparse, many survivors. Voices went unheard. The town near Emu Field, once bustling with workers and families, vanished without a trace. Buildings abandoned, roads cracked and reclaimed by the desert. Australia's government eventually sealed off the area, declaring it too dangerous to enter. But they never told the full story, leaving a radioactive secret buried in the dust. Radiation levels remain high. The Earth's scars are still visible from the sky. Satellite images reveal the ruined test sites, a silent reminder of forgotten consequences. Aboriginal communities faced the brunt. Their health deteriorated, their lands contaminated, and their cultures disrupted by an unseen war. The British government eventually compensated some victims, but many say justice never came. The truth remained hidden, buried under layers of government secrecy. This story is not just about bombs, it is about silence, about power, about those forgotten in history's shadow. Studio Bangla Network brings this story to light so the world can remember, so we can never forget the price of secrecy. The story of Emu Field is a warning that even in the most remote places, no secret can stay buried forever. The land remembers, the people remember, and now we remember too. We begin with a show of sweeping aerial shots over the red center of Australia. This harsh, unforgiving, ancient landscape then cuts to archival footage from the 1950s of mushroom clouds rising over a desert wasteland. These were atomic weapons tests conducted by the British at a remote Aboriginal community in the heart of Australia, an event that has left its mark on the land and people. The precise location is Emu Field, a dot on the map that appears to be nowhere. So we zoom right in, first across a map of Australia, then into South Australia, northwest of the state capital, Adelaide, and finally into this quadrant where a cluster of letters denotes the site of the British atomic weapon tests in 1952, 3 and 4. There are no photographs of what happened here, but we will use AI-generated scenes to approximate what life was like for the Aboriginal people who lived here before the explosions. We see them hunting and gathering in the dry landscape. There are many different tribes in this area, but they're all united against a common enemy, the white invaders who have stolen their land and are now stealing their lives. Next, we see radiation warning signs in the outback, close up on rusted metal buildings and deserted machinery left behind. We hear a distant explosion sound, under the low rumble of a Geiger counter. Then satellite imagery shows us the scars left on the land by decades of nuclear testing. Are these the same people? Here they are again. But now their land is poisoned and they are getting sick. Some are dying. And finally, if possible, we try to find footage of survivors or descendants of those who were exposed to the radiation. If we can get someone on camera, we ask them how this happened, how their land was stolen, how their people were exposed to radiation, and how their country became a nuclear wasteland. In 1952, the British government tested two atomic bombs near the Aboriginal settlement of Anau, in the remote Australian outback. It was the first ever nuclear test in the Southern Hemisphere, and it wiped its people and their culture off the face of the earth. Yet somehow their story has been erased from history. Until recently, most Australians had no idea this even happened here. In the early 1950s, the British colonial government was concerned about the growth of communism. They feared that if the Reds took over Indonesia and nearby West New Guinea, the Northern Territory would be next. So they decided to develop Maralinga in South Australia as a nuclear weapons test site. This was despite the area being sacred to the local Aboriginal people and home to rare species of plants and animals. But no one asked them, the traditional owners, the Arabana people. No one warned them. On October and November 1952, Britain detonated two atomic bombs at Emu Field. The first bomb was dropped by parachute from a B-24 Liberator bomber flying above Emu Field. The second bomb was dropped by hand from a different aircraft. The blasts were part of a series of tests, known as the British code-named Operation Hurricane. The purpose of the tests was to collect data for nuclear weapons development, including studies of the effects of radiation on human beings. But no one warned the local Aboriginal people to get out of the way. The first detonation at an Emu Field released about 10,000 times more radiation than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. A thermal picture taken from a plane minutes later shows the bomb blast incinerating everything around it. In the final analysis, the official inquiry admitted that the Aboriginal people were exposed to lethal levels of radiation. The report read, quote, "It is probable that some members of the community may have been killed by the radiation. However, when the British officials returned to the site afterwards, they could find no trace of the Aboriginal people. Their village had vanished, apparently blown away by the force of the blast. And so the British buried the evidence, covering up what had happened here. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, the British conducted hundreds of smaller radiological and chemical tests at an Emu Field. During this time, Britain brought 2,000 servicemen to the area, plus scientists and support staff. They built accommodation and facilities at a place they called Fort Astor. Again, the Aboriginal people were not told what was happening. On November 1953, another thermonuclear device was detonated at Emu Field, creating a fireball 300 feet high. The British were collecting data to help them build the hydrogen bomb. 3 years later, the British were back again for more tests. On October 1956, a massive blast flattened all the scrub on a 650 square mile stretch of land. Radiation swirled across the region. A Sydney newspaper reported, quote, "Australia has become a handy dumping ground for Britain's atomic explosions," end quote. The British continued testing nuclear weapons at Emu Field until 1963. By then, they had carried out 52 nuclear detonations here. As the British prepared to leave, they tried to clean up their mess. They gave the Aboriginal people a small area of land as compensation, but that land was contaminated. An aerial photograph taken in 1963 shows the extent of the damage caused by decades of nuclear testing. A vast crater is surrounded by a burnt orange glow. The site had been dubbed Ground Zero, but nothing could grow here now. The land was dead. Years later, scientists discovered that the nuclear contamination extended far beyond the test site. Radioactive waste had spread to 22 different locations, including the towns of Murray and Beltana, which were evacuated and bulldozed. The residents were given just 2 weeks to pack up and leave. But some people refused to go. They were offered money to move somewhere else, but they wanted to stay in their homes. Instead, The government bought their houses and businesses and moved them, ruble and all, to another part of the country. Entire streets were ripped up and carted away. The towns disappeared. Today, the stories of these places are also gone, wiped from the maps. We drive through the eerie silence of abandoned settlements. A rusty piano sits outside an empty house. A swing set sways gently in the wind. Clothes hang on a line. Here a child's shoe lies abandoned in the dust. The houses are gone, but the possessions left behind tell the story of everyday life. In the 1950s, a former British Army officer returned to live in Mare. He recalls the day the military showed up. Suddenly there were soldiers everywhere, trucks and jeeps roaring around town. Men in uniforms. The military set up a huge camp south of Mare, at a place called Bell. Officers arrived in jeeps, swaggering and shouting orders. Then came the scientists. Everything was kept secret. Trucks rumbled through the night, carrying God knows what. The officer thought he should be worried, but the town's leaders assured him there was nothing to fear. Life went on as normal. But 5 days before Christmas, 1952, the military arrived at the officer's house, demanding he pack up and leave immediately. He and his wife were given less than 12 hours to grab whatever they could carry and get out. The military drove them to the outskirts of town and pointed them towards Port Augusta. "Get out of here. You can stay there." The officer remembers them saying, "In 2021, satellite images reveal the true extent of the damage done to the land. Using a natural color palette, we see how the nuclear tests scarred the landscape. Tracks from vehicles used in the weapons tests are still visible. The British buried much of the nuclear waste, but some of it remains on the surface. The site is too dangerous for people to live there. But scientists have found a way to detect what's below the sand. In recent years, Australian scientists have helped uncover the truth of what happened at an emu field. Researchers have collected soil samples, examined aerial photographs and uncovered previously classified documents. Now we know that the nuclear testing caused widespread contamination of the land. Radioactive waste was spread to 22 different locations, including underground water supplies. The fallout also spread to other parts of Australia, to Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria, but no one knew this at the time. In 1979, an inquiry was established to investigate the effects of the British nuclear tests. Evidence was heard in private, and no transcripts were kept, but the findings of the inquiry were suppressed for more than 30 years. In 2010, the government declassified the report and made it public. It revealed that the Aboriginal people exposed to radiation during the nuclear tests suffered a higher rate of cancer and other illnesses. Despite this, the report concluded that there was no link between the tests and the health problems experienced by Aboriginal people since, in 2017, the Australian government announced that the descendants of the Aboriginal people exposed to radiation would receive a one-off payment of $25,000 per person. This was described as compensation for the loss of their culture, but the payment did not cover medical expenses, legal costs, or ongoing therapy. Many of the people affected by the nuclear testing died before receiving any compensation, and in the end, no amount of money can compensate for the loss of culture and identity. The British government apologized to the Aboriginal people in 2007, but that was too late for many. At least 200 people were directly exposed to the radiation from the atomic weapons tests, but it's impossible to know how many people were affected in the long term. Here we see a mock newsreel effect, with text overlaid reading, "Britain tested nukes here, no one was warned." And still radioactive today. We hear the low rumble of a Geiger counter clicking intermittently, and a distant explosion sound. In the final 60 seconds, we fade slowly to black, ending on the quote, "Some scars the land never forgets." Thank you for watching this episode of the Australian town that was nuked and erased. This is a Studio Bangla Network original.